Our topic for today is tribalism, political bias, and the search for truth with psychologist Cory Clark. And uh, let's see now. Cory Clark is an associate professor of psychology at the New College of Florida and an executive director of the Adversarial Collaboration Project at the University of Pennsylvania. She received her doctorate in social and personality psychology from the University of California, Irvine, and has previously worked as an assistant professor of behavioral science at Durham University and as the director of academic engagement for Heterodox Academy. Her research explores how social, moral, and political motivations interfere with the objective pursuit of truth. So we're looking forward to this because this is an issue that we very much are concerned with at NAUA, and we would look forward to hearing what you have to say about that.
Great. Thanks so much for having me and for everyone being willing to meet in the middle of the day. I hope it's not too much of an inconvenience. Okay, so I'm gonna hit share and then hope that works. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna start kind of like big picture broad, like why would it be the case that humans ever wouldn't just pursue truth when they think they're pursuing truth and they think they're trying to have, a pretty well-rounded understanding of the world? Like what are the concerns people have and why do they have them? And then I'll kind of shift into a little bit what's happening in the social and behavioral sciences, which is the area I'm most familiar with, and like what kinds of social concerns might be influencing what scientists come to believe is true, and what are the specific domains where they're not able to pursue truth, or at least they have biases because they have these other social concerns, given that they're in a particular social community where they're trying to seek status and fit in. So that's kind of how I'll go. I'll kind of move into a specific project where I interviewed and surveyed psychology professors and talk about like what their concerns are when it comes to the pursuit of truth. So that's kind of where we're going. So, oh wait, let's see. There we go. Let me move this up here too. Um, so one of the most important things I think to remember about human psychology and how humans deal with information is just remembering that humans are a social species like other social animals. So we evolved in small interdependent groups. We spent most of human evolutionary history in these smaller bands of people. And one of the great advantages that humans have is that they were able to coordinate and cooperate so well with other humans in order to take on challenges that were much bigger than themselves. So if I were to drop any one of us into a jungle today without a cell phone, without any weapons or tools, probably most of us wouldn't survive very long. But when humans work together, they're able to, kill animals that are much larger than them and that have bigger teeth and bigger claws and run faster. So humans' advantage really is this cooperativeness and this cooperation with our small local groups. And because of this, humans had to be vigilant about group members who were posing cost to the groups. This includes free riders, of course, people who aren't contributing, but it also includes defectors, people who aren't getting along with the group, aren't committed to the group, maybe are taking advantage of the group and not contributing. So we're hyper vigilant about other people's loyalty to the groups that we're a part of, which means that we also have to be concerned about proving to our immediate social groups that we are these committed, loyal group members. And so humans evolved to be tribal. And what I mean by that is just that we are constantly worried about our social standing in our social group. And we are constantly monitoring our status among our local group, and are particularly afraid of being ostracized or kicked out of the group or losing social standing. So we evolved to be loyal, to be conformist. We think of conformity often, it's portrayed as a bad thing, but for the most part, it's a good thing. It helps people coordinate and tackle challenges really well. We also evolved to be defensive of our in-group, willing to fight for our in-group if necessary, and to be hostile to out-groups, people who are trying to take our land and resources. We have to choose sides because that's how we demonstrate that we're loyal to our social groups. And we also evolved to be highly protective of our social reputations and to fear ostracism. This is one reason why social exclusion is incredibly painful, even as adults. If you go to like a party and everyone knows everyone and you don't know anybody, it's really awkward and it feels kind of terrible because being on the outside is really, it's an unpleasant experience. And that's your brain telling you this is bad, avoid it. So what our brains are trying to do is to fit in, to have friends, to be well liked, to get status in our immediate social groups. And we interact with the world in ways that help us pursue that social status and avoid getting socially excluded or ostracized. Again, because this would have led to death, and people who were bad group members wouldn't have survived and passed their genes on to modern humans. It's even true in modern society. Like when we think about evolutionary history, we're talking, hundreds, thousands of years ago, tens thousands of years ago. But it's actually still the case in modern society that the way people get status is by being good group members. So this is a paper by Buss. He has a couple papers that are similar to this, where they look at how people get status across different cultures, different countries. And it's kind of the same everywhere. The way people get status is by being a trusted group member, by being intelligent, by being accepted at a prestigious university. So having skills and competencies that contribute to being a good group member, having abilities that help you help other people. That's how people get status. And pretty much all of the ways that people lose status is by being bad group members. So if you look down these 15 status decreasing criteria, failing to perform a group task, getting dismissed from school, being lazy, all of them being unable to control sexual behavior when drunk, all of them are kind of things that pose costs to the social group. So even in modern societies, the way we get status is by being good group members, and the way we lose status is by being bad group members. And so people have to manage their reputations all the time and make sure they're demonstrating to their social groups that they are these good group members. And so we can see the sort of traces of these evolved psychological tendencies and among modern humans. So we can see this very easily with things like our ethnic groups and our religious groups and our political groups and sports teams. Like some places people get killed or beat up for rooting for the wrong sports team, even though this seems like a relatively trivial, group identity. You can even get serious conflicts over local identities, like liking the wrong kind of pizza. I'm from Ohio, from Northeastern Ohio, and there's these two burger joints, Swenson's and Skyway, and like you pick a side, and then you only be friends with people who like the same burger as you. So we're good at sorting into these groups. And then once we do sort into these groups, we start treating our out groups terribly and treating our in groups really well. And all of this is just kind of signaling the importance of being a good group member to humans. And this can influence how we interact with information and how we decide what's true. I think a really good example to think of is with religion in particular, because people tend to come to believe the religion of their local community. There are a lot of different religions across the world, and people sort of get born into them and they believe what their local community believes. And it's still the case in some places in the world that if you have the wrong religious belief, you can get killed. Like we still kill people for holding the wrong religious beliefs, even in modern society. And what this tells us is that it's really important to conform to local beliefs. And people who failed to conform to local beliefs were putting themselves at a serious risk, and they'd be less likely to pass on their genes to later humans. And so we should expect that humans have sort of like the cognitive equipment to come to the right beliefs. And by the right beliefs, I don't necessarily mean true beliefs. I mean beliefs that help them stay in good social standing with their immediate or local social group. So what does this look like in practice? I kind of break it into two levels. The first is called selective exposure. And what this means is, or rather, what this refers to is how people approach and avoid information. So there's so much information in the world, you can't know everything. You have to seek out certain kinds of information, avoid other kinds of information. You can only attend to so much. And so we choose which newspaper outlets to read, which news networks to listen to on social media. We choose who to follow. Um, and so the way we can sort of shape the information that we're exposed to, and thus what we come to believe, is by only following sources, only listening to sources that are going to confirm and support the beliefs that allow us to stay in good social standing. So confirming our in-groups beliefs. Even pre-media, what you get really is social behavior. So you have a set of friends. Your friends are going to tend to be people who agree with you on important issues, especially issues that are important to your social groups and your social standing within those groups. And so we surround ourselves with friends and acquaintances that are going to reinforce those beliefs and thus not put us in a position of being exposed to beliefs that could harm our social status. Um, there's even this research looking at migration patterns within the US, and people have segregated politically over time. It used to be the case that communities were pretty well mixed politically, like good mix of Democrats and Republicans in counties across the United States. But over time, they've segregated more and more and more, and they tend to start leaning Republican or Democrat. And what this suggests is that people are actually moving to be around like-minded people and avoid people who are dissimilar from them. And this makes sense because, like, being in a more homogenous community where everyone agrees and you fit into that community and you share all of their beliefs, it feels better. And you can get more social status in that community than you could in a community of people who disagree with you on everything you think. This figure here is from a paper of social media behavior. These are retweets among people that can be reliably coded as Democrats or Republicans, and the lines between them are people retweeting each other. And what you can see is that people on the left are all engaging with each other, and people on the right, that's the red dots, those are all engaging with each other. And there's not a whole lot of crossover. And to the extent that there is crossover, I suspect a lot of it is like, look how dumb this person is, like you're not retweeting them to be like, oh, this is so interesting. Look what this person, I've never heard this before. It's probably mostly mocking them. And that helps you get status in your community too, because you're making fun of the enemy. The second layer is motivated reasoning, and this is what happens when you've already been exposed to the information. So with selective exposure, you get to choose what you pursue and what you avoid. That's easy because you don't have to assimilate information you never see. Motivated reasoning is what happens when you're actually exposed to information you do or do not want to believe. And essentially, people are credulous toward information that supports their group's beliefs and skeptical of information that challenges it. The classic study that looked at this, I think probably the most famous study that like looked at how people do this, is the study by Lord Ross and Lepper from 1979. They had proponents and opponents of the death penalty. Um, and they gave them methods of a scientific study, and the methods were identical. So across the two studies, they compared states before and after the adoption of the death penalty. So the methods are exactly the same. And then the results of the study either showed that the death penalty does or does not deter violent crime, or deter murder, homicide rates. And what they found was that proponents thought the methods were better when the results supported the deterrent efficacy of the death penalty, and opponents thought it was a better study when it challenged the deterrent efficacy of the death penalty. So exact same methods, but the methods are better methods if the result supports the belief that I want to have, and they're crappy if it supports the conclusion I don't want to believe. There have been dozens and dozens of studies very similar to this, that look at motivated reasoning in the context of politics in particular, where you just see that people are, they hold belief confirming evidence to lower standards than more challenging evidence. So this was like early in my grad school career, like more than 10 years ago. Um, I was sort of studying motivated reasoning. My lab was studying motivated reasoning, but there wasn't a lot of research considering the possibility that, scientists are susceptible to the very same biases that they accuse the public of. Um, but there is a sort of homogenous community among social social and behavioral scientists, they tend to be politically left-leaning. It's very obvious. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time with them to realize that they're politically left-leaning based on who they mock out loud and what they take for granted. And so I started wondering if we could identify potential motivated reasoning or political biases among social scientists, knowing that they are this homogenous, progressive community of people who have predictable desires. Um, so we know that academics, social scientists, behavioral scientists, it's kind of true of academics in general, but it's particularly true of scholars in the social behavioral scientists that they're overwhelmingly left-leaning. So we can kind of predict where we would expect them to have biases. And the first would be claims about political identities. They, of course, should believe research showing that left-leaning people are better than right-leaning people. That's good research, and research that finds the opposite is bad research, even if it's exactly the same sample, same methods. They should be more willing to believe that liberals or left-leaning people are good and right-leaning people are bad. But we also can expect that they would have some biases when it comes to certain sacred values in the sort of progressive community. And those, I guess, two of the big ones regard sex and race, and particularly equality of the sexes and equality of the races. These are really hot button issues and really important to sort of the progressive worldview. Um, so I've done a few studies now looking at these possibilities. I'll start first with this political identity question. So there's been decades of research showing that indeed political conservatives, people on the right, are more biased, more bigoted, more authoritarian, more resistant to science, less willing to update their views. They're more tribal, they're more loyal to their in-groups. This was decades and decades of research showing these things. And it seemed possible. Maybe the reason scholars were able to come to that conclusion so definitively is because those conclusions would be satisfying to them and they would have no reason to, it would be motivated credulity. They would just believe it feels right, sounds right, makes us all look good. And so let's move forward with this conclusion without really scrutinizing the evidence or looking for the potential opposite of that. So my lab in grad school, this was around the time I finished my PhD, we conducted this meta-analysis where we looked at every study, that Lord Ross and Lepper study that I showed you, dozens of studies just like that, where you have left-leaning people and right-leaning people evaluating the exact same piece of information, but it's manipulated to be more flattering to the left or right. I think there were about 54 of those kinds of studies that we identified. And we wanted to see if we summarize across all of the available evidence, is it true that conservatives are more biased than liberals? Before we finished this meta-analysis, we conducted a little poll and just asked people, Democrats and Republicans, who's more biased, Democrats or Republicans? And you can see among Democrats that they think Republicans are more biased than Democrats are. And if you look among Republicans, they think that Democrats are more biased than Republicans are. And this just perfectly foreshadows the results that we ended up finding, which was that conservatives and liberals, we can call these right-leaning people and left-leaning people, whatever terms you prefer, that they're virtually identically biased. They're both biased. They both are more credulous toward information they want to believe and more skeptical of information they don't want to believe, and to virtually identical degrees. There was no statistical difference between these two groups. One thing that was kind of amusing to me after we published this meta-analysis was that a lot of people were pissed. They did not like the results of our meta-analysis, and they started scrutinizing the kinds of studies we included, even though we included the studies that measure motivated reasoning and the way the field's been measuring it for decades. This was the accepted way to measure it. Now all of a sudden they're like, oh, liberals and conservatives are equally. That cannot be possibly true. There's something wrong with this paper. And so it felt like excessive scrutiny because they didn't like the conclusion of the research, which was more than a little bit ironic. But this was sort of a turning point in the social behavioral sciences where a lot of younger scholars were coming up and challenging some existing, I don't want to call them consensuses, but conclusions that were pretty popular and well accepted in the social and behavior sciences. So, for example, there was this tradition of research on authoritarianism. There was a scale called the right-wing authoritarianism scale, I think it's called. Um, but for decades, everyone had concluded that authoritarianism was predominantly a right-leaning thing. There was even a paper that said finding left-leaning authoritarianism would be the equivalent of finding the Loch Ness monster. It just doesn't exist. Um, and then just in the past 10 years, scholars started retesting that conclusion and finding that if we just change the scales in ways that tap into the kinds of like concerns people on the left would have, that left-leaning people are just as authoritarian as right-leaning people, and left-leaning authoritarianism predicts all of the same things that right-leaning authoritarianism does too, like support for political violence, for example. So it seems that there's really not much of a difference there. Similarly, with in-group favoritism, treating in-group members better than out-group members. For a long time, people thought that conservatives displayed this tendency more. They were more group loyal, they were more intolerant of other people. But it turns out the groups that had been studied were groups that are viewed as left-leaning. And if you ask about tolerance toward right-leaning groups, people on the left are just as intolerant toward them as people on the left are toward right-leaning groups. So it's just we weren't asking about the right kinds of groups. And in fact, the correlation between political intolerance and basically the political identity of the person displaying the intolerance and how they view that group as left-leaning or right-leaning, it's almost a one-to-one correlation, meaning the more I view those people as my outgroup, the more I dislike them and I hate them and I don't want them to have free speech rights and things like that. And this happens across the political spectrum. So it's really just this in-group, out-group dynamic that we see in virtually identical degrees on the political left and right. Same thing for outgroup discrimination, and same thing as I just showed you with politically motivated reasoning. So for many decades, we had all of these conclusions in the research that right-leaning people are worse in virtually all ways. And then if we just change how we ask the question, we see no, people on the left and right are very similar in how they treat other people and how they treat discordant information that they don't want to agree with. So this all looks like potentially we were sort of satisfied with these conclusions because they were flattering to the scholars who were conducting this research. Um, but there are other issues too, and I think these are potentially maybe even bigger issues. Progressives care a lot about equality or egalitarianism, and they're particularly concerned with sex and race. And there's increasingly evidence that scholars are particularly biased when it comes to these issues, again, because they are these sort of like progressive hot button issues. This was one of the first studies to find evidence for that bias. This was in a sample of social psychology professors. I'm a social psychology professor. Um, what they found was scholars were more likely to agree that it was possible that women evolved to be more verbally talented than men, that men evolved to be more mathematically talented than women. I know of no reason why you would find one of these more plausible than the other than that in one case, it's sort of confirming the stereotype that men are better than women at math, and that's something that progressives don't like. So it seems more implausible to them than the opposite conclusion where women are portrayed better. Something very similar when it comes to ethnic differences. Scholars were much more likely to agree that some ethnic groups evolved to be more athletic than other ethnic groups, than to agree that some ethnic groups might have evolved to be more intelligent than other ethnic groups. So this is a really like taboo hot button issue again, but if you're portraying like a particular group as better than the other, essentially progressives have a reverse bias where like what we think of as stereotypical for like sexism and racism, progressives have sort of like the opposite concern and overcorrect. And we'll see this again and again in other studies as well. This is a study by Michael Shearer. This was particularly cool. I'm like a low-level co-author on this paper, but they did a meta-analysis of um, field audit studies for sex discrimination in hiring. These are studies where scholars submitted identical resumes to real jobs and just changed the name. So this has a female's name or it has a male's name, and they're applying for these jobs. They took every single study that had been yeah, so it had all these studies that have been conducted over the past like 40 decades, 50 decades. And summarize the direction of the hiring biases. So were these jobs more likely to call back the female applicants or the male applicants? They were. I'm gonna let him out of his cage. I have no control over my dogs, clearly. Um, um, Anyway, so what this figure shows here, the black bars are what the results actually showed, and this is male typed jobs or gender balanced jobs, and this is female type jobs. So I mean like stereotypical male, like an engineer, or stereotypical female, like a nurse, for example. The black bars show our actual results of the meta-analysis. So what we see is around like 1976 to 1986, it really was true that jobs were slightly discriminating in favor of men over women. And this was still true around 1987 to 1997. But starting around 1998, the pattern actually flips. So for male stereotypical jobs, they're actually hiring in favor of women over men. So the biases are favoring women for these kinds of jobs. Similarly for the field jobs, the female jobs, there weren't any data for like decades ago, but these jobs were discriminating in favor of women for female stereotypical jobs. What we have with these like medium gray bars is what academics expected. And so what we can see here is that academics wildly overestimated the extent of anti-female hiring discrimination in the past and even into the present. So they still think that females are disadvantaged in hiring for male stereotypical jobs when in fact males are disadvantaged for those jobs. So it's a failure to correct as all this evidence comes in and we see, yes, women used to be discriminated against, they're not anymore. At least in the best studies we have on hiring discrimination. And scholars continue to believe that women are being disadvantaged. We actually see something kind of similar for the female type jobs too, where academics wildly overestimate discrimination against men for female stereotypical jobs. Um, but their beliefs are like slightly more aligned with the evidence in that domain. But one thing that was kind of interesting here is that the more gender egalitarian scholars were, the more wrong they were. So the more they wanted men and women to be equal, the more they thought this discrimination was huge and it was still happening, when really sex-based discrimination in hiring is pretty much disappeared over time. Less so for female stereotypical jobs than male stereotypical jobs. Um, but it's nowhere near the level that scholars think it is. Similarly, and this is the one study I mentioned that isn't published yet, it's currently under review. We summarized all of the domains of discrimination in academia for which we had good data. And what we found, so we looked in salaries, are men or women paid better for the same job? Teaching evaluations, do men or women get evaluated better when they're teaching? You know, the best studies experimentally manipulate like an online class and say, your teacher's a woman or your teacher's a man, and the student doesn't know. And do people give the men more favorable teaching evaluations than the women? We looked at promotions. Do men or women get promoted faster with the same credentials? Citations, awarding authorship. So do you get to be a co-author on a paper you contributed to? Letters of recommendation. So what are people saying about men and women, job applicants? Receiving grants, acceptance rates at journals, tenure track hiring, and admission into this prestigious society. And we broke them down into these four domains. So up here, this is evidence where it does seem to be there's maybe a little bit of bias against female academics still. That's for salary and teaching evaluations. Domains where the evidence is inconclusive, and by that I mean it's just all over the place. Like it would be hard to draw a conclusion one way or the other that there's any sex discrimination in those domains. Domains where there's evidence of gender neutrality, meaning there's evidence that there isn't any sex discrimination in those domains. And then domains where there's evidence of pro-female bias. So in these two domains, tenure track hiring, women are actually more likely to get hired than men. with the exact same CV, and they're more likely to get admitted into these prestigious societies with the exact same, scholarly record. But what the bars here show is that across virtually all domains, academics believed that there was a large amount of discrimination against women. So even though we only see anti-female discrimination in two domains, they believed that there was anti-female discrimination in virtually all domains. Not so much in this one, but this one actually favors women, so they're still wrong. In all cases, they are wildly exaggerating anti-female discrimination in academia. Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't think there's anybody there, so you should stop. Um, and what was interesting with this one was that scholars who had more expertise in sex discrimination, so this is scholars who've published more papers on sex discrimination, they were the most wrong. So having more expertise on this topic translates to having the most false beliefs, the most incorrect views about what's actually happening in academia. And I think what we have in the last study and this study, being more gender egalitarian or being an expert in sex discrimination, it's really part of like the scholar's identity to have this concern about anti-female bias. And so they persist in these beliefs that women are suffering discrimination when they're really not anymore. Certainly not where they were, and even when they were getting discriminated against, it wasn't all that much. But scholars are failing to update their beliefs, I think largely for sort of like political reasons that their community has this view that people are sexist against women, not against men. And so you have to persist in the belief that they're suffering all of this discrimination still. So all of that was kind of sort of speculative, I suppose I could say. Like it makes sense that scholars would be particularly biased about sex and race. But in this paper, I really wanted to hear directly from scholars, like what is it that they feel they can't study, that they can't pursue, what's going to happen to them if they study the wrong thing or say the wrong thing. And so in this paper, I interviewed and then surveyed a bunch of psychology professors. So I first interviewed about 41 psychology professors and I had them nominate topics for things that they couldn't study or talk about honestly. And then I surveyed 470 psychology professors just to have like a more representative sample about what's happening in really the social sciences more generally, but psychology specifically. So the first question I asked people was, are there empirical conclusions in your field that are off limits in the sense that if you reported data supporting that conclusion, you would be formally or informally punished, shunned, or ostracized by your peers? And if so, what are those conclusions? So this was in my interviews. 90% said yes, there are some conclusions that they cannot pursue without getting socially sanctioned somehow. And this is going to be a lot of text, but I think it's sort of important because you'll get to see what the psychology professors are saying in their own words, without me like prompting them in any way, because they all kind of say the same things, which suggests that everybody sort of knows what you're not allowed to study and what you're not allowed to say. So almost 87% specifically mentioned group differences are off limits. 76% said race differences specifically, and about 29% said sex or gender differences specifically. About 47% said differences in IQ, intelligence, cognitive skills, intellectual domains or pursuits, or smartness. So those are all kind of similar. It's all about, cognitive ability. And then 44% mentioned other domains that are still kind of related to cognitive ability, or at least like general like life success, I suppose. So school and academic performance and educational outcomes, work and occupational performance, self-control, criminality and police contact, mating behaviors or attraction, differences in professions, sprinting speed, socioeconomic status, violence, racial biases and hate crime rates, general abilities and competencies or general achievement, any socially or societally valued outcome or traits, or any unipolar behavior or outcome where it is easy to assign a good and bad end. So what they're saying here is that you cannot study differences between groups in these outcomes, which are all essentially related to socially valued traits. You can't say that one group is better or worse than another group in any of these socially important outcomes. About 58% said it's specifically genetic, biological, evolved, natural, innate, inherent, intrinsic, internal, essentialist, immutable, concrete, immovable, or nativist causes or explanations. So we're allowed to talk about group differences, but we're not allowed to talk about them if we think that they might be genetic or biological or evolved. And a lot of them offered explanations you're allowed to provide if you want to talk about group differences. So you can talk about group differences if you attribute those differences to society or social environments or socialization or structuralist frameworks or discrimination, oppression, trauma, bad schools, nurture, or blank slatism. So it's not just that we can't talk about group differences, it's that there's a certain category of explanations that is off limits. And then there's another category, which is, discrimination, oppression, that you're allowed to attribute differences to. Um, 24% mentioned any explanation that could be perceived as blaming the group or the victim, that could be perceived as perpetuating isms, stigmatizing, confirming racist stereotypes, justifying future or past harms or different treatment, or attributing fault or responsibility because of group's behavior or culture. And then about 61% mentioned that it's a particular group that cannot be portrayed negatively. About 47%, you cannot portray Black people or African Americans negatively. About 13% said you cannot portray women negatively. And about 32% mentioned broader categories, so oppressed or vulnerable groups, non-white people or people of color, racial or ethnic minorities, underrepresented minorities, or racial groups with subordinate positions. So it's not just that you can't talk about group differences, it's that you can't talk about a particular kind, attribute it to a particular cause, and portray a particular group as being better or worse than another group. And you can see that like in those von Hippel and Bus data I presented. If it's a difference that favors women, cool. But if it's a difference that favors men, not okay. So we're sort of ruling out a sort of category of conclusions and a category of explanations because they don't conform to really what progressives want to believe is true about the world. Um, Scholars mentioned a couple other things too. So LGBTQ issues, biases in academia, evolutionary claims more broadly. And I use these responses to come up with 10 distinct taboo conclusions to ask follow-up questions about. And I also asked like how much they were afraid of different consequences and what they hoped would happen to other people who studied these topics, just so I could get a sense of, what are the actual things that people are afraid of and why they won't pursue these topics, or say them out loud if they think they might be true. Um, so in the main study, I surveyed 470 psychology professors. My response rate was pretty low, but I did do some representativeness checks that made them look pretty similar to psychology professors more generally. So I don't think my sample was particularly odd. So the first thing I asked, I presented participants with these 10 taboo conclusions, and I asked them how much they believe those conclusions were true or false, and then how much they self-censor their own empirical beliefs about those conclusions. Here are the 10 conclusions. I'll read them for you quickly. I know I'm already like running over time a little bit. Um, Wait, am I? What time is it? No, I've got a little bit of time. So they are the tendency to engage in sexually coercive behavior likely evolved because it conferred some evolutionary advantages on men who engaged in such behavior. Gender biases are not the most important drivers of the underrepresentation of women in STEM fields. Academia discriminates against Black people. This one was nominated by people, but ultimately it was very clear that disagreeing with that is more taboo than agreeing with that. So you'll see that one shows the sort of opposite pattern as all the other ones. Biological sex is binary for the vast majority of people. The social sciences discriminate against conservatives. Racial biases are not the most important drivers of higher crime rates among Black Americans relative to white Americans. Men and women have different psychological characteristics because of evolution. Genetic differences explain non-trivial variance in race differences in intelligence test scores. Transgender identity is sometimes the product of social influence, and demographic diversity in the workplace often leads to worse performance. So the first thing I look at is how much do people believe these conclusions are true, and how unwilling are they to say it out loud that they think it's true. Um, And here are the figures for those data. I'll explain what's on this slide. So basically what we have here is each of the conclusions, each of the taboo conclusions that I just read. Along the x-axis, I have how much people believe that it's true. And along the y-axis, how much they self-censor. So how unwilling are they to say out loud that they think this thing is empirically correct? And then each dot is a participant. So what you can see across all of these 10 taboo conclusions, the first thing that I think is interesting is this, that some professors are 100% certain that the conclusions are true, and other professors are 100% certain that the conclusions are false. I find this kind of interesting because you will get a sort of argumentative tactic, I think, where people will claim that something is a scientific consensus. But I think people only really say that when there isn't a scientific consensus, because if it's something that's boring and there is a scientific consensus about it, like the atomic composition of carbon or something, you would never need to declare there's a scientific consensus because there's no argument, there's no debate, right? Like it's a consensus. We've moved on, we've established a fact. When people are talking about scientific consensus, they're often trying to persuade people that their side is right because this is what scientists believe. But in those cases, it's going to be something contentious and there isn't going to be a scientific consensus. And that's kind of what we see here. We have all of these controversial conclusions. Um, and there's nothing resembling a scientific consensus on any of them, I don't think. And in fact, you have something even more puzzling, which is some people are 100% certain the thing is true, and others are 100% certain the thing is false. And these are all conclusions like within the realm of their expertise. So we're really getting like wild disagreement across these taboo conclusions. We also see that most professors are self-censoring somewhat, so they're not really comfortable talking about their empirical beliefs on these issues. And then the other important thing is that belief in the truth is associated with self-censorship. So that's what all of these positive slopes indicate. Again, this was that one that's flipped, so it's more taboo to disagree than to agree. And so we see people who think academia doesn't discriminate against Black people are self-censoring much more than people who think academia is discriminating against Black people. So this is the controversial conclusion. And we see these slopes for all of the taboo conclusions. And what this means is that it is probably true that our perceptions of scientific consensuses surrounding these controversial conclusions is systematically biased toward rejecting them. The sort of discourse, the public discourse is systematically biased toward socially desirable empirical beliefs and away from the controversial empirical beliefs. And so if you were trying to assess what do scientists think about this, but only scientists who think it's false will say so out loud, and all of these people are quiet, it makes it really hard to understand what experts actually believe about any of these topics. I asked professors, if you were to share your empirical beliefs openly, how at risk would you feel for the following consequences, and presented a set of consequences. The reason I put in red your empirical beliefs here is because I didn't ask them like what would happen to you if you said the worst thing you could think of, or if you said like the most controversial thing in all of your discipline. It was what would happen if you just said what you believe is empirically correct out loud. So whatever their beliefs are, controversial or not, what would happen to them? Um, and we see a fair bit of concern across all of these different consequences. So being attacked on social media, a lot of concern about that one. Being ostracized by peers. This I find interesting because it goes back to sort of the start of my talk that one of our biggest fears is being ostracized, being socially excluded. And people think if they were just to say out loud what they believe is empirically true, they might lose their friends, right? They are going to lose their social standing. And so these are professors, people with PhDs, people who are paid to pursue truth, and they're afraid to say what they think is true because they're afraid that other professors won't like them anymore. Being stigmatized or labeled pejorative terms, a bit of fear of that one, some career damaging biases against them, guilt by association harm to students and colleagues, student boycotts, disciplinary actions. Not a lot of threats of physical violence, but actually a little bit more than I would think, given that I've never seen anyone get punched like at a conference. I've seen people get yelled at. I haven't seen physical violence yet. And then not a whole lot of fear of getting fired, but a little bit of fear of getting fired. And one thing that I found kind of interesting is that for all of these, we saw no differences in these perceived risks or in self-censorship between tenured and untenured professors. And a lot of people say the point of tenure is to kind of, like free the professor. You don't have to worry about anything. You pursue truth. Like consequences be there aren't going to be any consequences. But we don't see any differences in self-censorship between the tenured and untenured, and we don't see differences in risk perception. And I think the reason for that is because tenure is supposed to protect this piece right here, this like getting fired piece. But that's not what professors are particularly afraid of. What they're afraid of is this stuff. They're afraid of being disliked. They're afraid of being called mean names. They're afraid of being shamed on social media. They're afraid of they're afraid of reputational damage. And tenure does nothing to prevent reputational damage. And so tenure really can't fix this issue, which is that professors, like anybody else, are people who really care about their reputations and their status and fitting in and having friends and being well liked. And so long as that's true, and you have these, controversial conclusions, scholars are going to be reluctant to pursue them. And even if they do pursue them, if they find the wrong thing, they're going to be reluctant to publish it or talk about it openly. I asked professors, imagine a scholar who forwarded a genetic or evolutionary explanation for gender or racial differences in a socially valued outcome. Remember, that's like the big, broad category of like controversial conclusion. Anything that fits into that description is going to be scary for scientists, for scholars. Which actions would you support against him or her? So this is looking at what do they think should happen to other people who pursue these controversial conclusions. And we don't see a lot of support for the bad things. So virtually everyone supports normal scientific criticism. A lot of support for that. Virtually everyone supports it. There's less support for all of these, but there is a little support for all of them too. So removing them from leadership positions, disinviting them from talks, not hiring or promoting them, even if they meet typical standards, socially ostracizing them, refusing to publish their work regardless of its merits, shaming them on social media, publicly labeling them pejorative terms, firing them, or stigmatizing their grad students or co-authors. So what I think is kind of interesting here is that the fear, like what we see here, is much larger than the number of people who actually, or rather the amount of support that these things should happen to people who say the controversial thing. Um, and so I think there's like two ways to interpret this. One is that scholars are more afraid than they ought to be, that these bad things probably wouldn't happen to them if they pursued them, even these controversial conclusions. But you might say actually they're rational because there is some support. And if you just have like one enemy who's willing to dedicate their whole entire life to ruining your life, they might succeed, right? So like even if you don't have a lot of support for some of these social consequences, if you have a little bit of support and that support is really dedicated, it still could cause big problems in your life. So it's hard to say how rational this fear is that scholars are having. I wanted to highlight one other thing because I think it also demonstrates how differences in social concerns can shape attitudes towards science and even what people come to believe. So I had one question in my survey. Should scholars be completely free to pursue research questions without fear of institutional punishment for their conclusion? What we saw was that most male psychology professors said yes, and most female psychology professors said it's complicated. And a similar question, if pursuit of truth and social equity goals appear to come into conflict, which should scientists prioritize? Most men say truth, whereas most female psychology professors say it's complicated. And I saw these patterns across virtually every question I asked, that men and women have different priorities for science. Um, And I think this is due to men and women having different social concerns and having different priorities. I could give a whole nother talk on that issue. If people want to talk about it, we can. Um, but the fact that the sex of the psychology professor kind of shapes what they think science ought to be doing in the first place. And then you'll see on the next slide, it even shapes what they believe to be true, suggests that different kinds of social concerns are affecting the conclusions that scientists draw. This is looking at gender differences in those taboo conclusions in belief that they're truth. So I'm just going to highlight four of them. So, for the conclusion that biological sex is binary for the vast majority of people, most men think that is empirically correct, whereas women are quite on the fence about whether that's true or not. Men and women evolve different psychological characteristics. Most men believe that is empirically correct, whereas female psychology professors are quite on the fence on that one. Um, that genes contribute to race differences in intelligence test scores. Most women are quite sure that is false, whereas men are more on the fence on that one. And for academia discriminates against Black people, most women think that's true, and most men are, or rather, men are on the fence on that one too. What's interesting about these is that suggests the possibility that if you have a male or female psychology professor, you might end up getting taught different things about what's true, what's false, or what we don't know. And similarly, I think looking back at just the differences in priorities, even like what the purpose of science is varying based on the sex of the scholar. And again, I we can talk about that if you guys are interested. Um, but I think because men and women have these like slightly different priorities, it sort of shapes how they interact with information and then ultimately what they come to believe and probably also pursue in their work. Um, so yeah, so I guess my final conclusion is just that scientists are humans, and like all humans, they have social concerns. They want to be well liked, they want to be popular, they want to have social status. And when they're embedded in a community that has a particular set of political values, that puts pressure on them, whether they want it or not. I think some of them are perfectly happy to be in a community that is sort of prioritizing progressive values and perspectives. Others maybe aren't happy about it, but nonetheless, they are there and they have to worry about if I say this thing that challenges, what progressives want to believe is true about the world, am I going to get targeted by my peers? Am I going to have my students boycott my class and suffer all these unpleasant social consequences as a result of my scholarship and literally just reporting what I think might be empirically accurate. The scientific method, of course, is intended to steer scholars toward truth, and I think it does an okay job at that. We do have to persuade peer reviewers that our work is reasonably high quality. Of course, it still varies quite a bit from outlet to outlet and even decision to decision within the same outlet. But that doesn't always happen. And even when it does happen, it might take a very, very long time, especially when you have what I think is happening is a lot of self-censorship and just not pursuing certain research conclusions. You're allowed to pursue this set, you're not allowed to pursue this set. And this is just going to completely distort the scientific record and make it look like everyone agrees this is true and that this is nonsense. But it's no one can pursue this side because everyone's too afraid that if they did, they might pay a huge reputational price. I don't usually like give people recommendations because I don't think it's really like my thing. I don't study, how people could be better consumers of science, but I just thought given the subject of the talk, maybe I should just touch briefly on like what I try to do when I'm trying to figure out what is true. The first is looking for independent replication and verification. So looking for conclusions that have been affirmed by multiple labs. If there's a particular finding that's really popular in one lab, that professor, all their grad students, and that's it, it suggests that it might not be a particularly replicable or reliable finding. Of course, look for opposing views. My talk kind of suggests that even if you look for opposing views, you might not find them when they do exist. But I think there are usually at least some courageous people out there, or people who've already paid such a huge reputational price that they don't care anymore. And so they're willing to say the things that no one else is willing to say. So looking for those views, and seeing if they exist, and then what does their evidence look like compared to whatever the more mainstream perspective is. Looking for sane scholars who hold themselves to high standards, so scholars who use open science practices, who are transparent in their reporting, and people who I think just communicate their findings with a little bit more nuance. If they're like only ever on one side and like really forcefully so, then they might be like doing a different game than science. And then the last is just holding your beliefs flexibly and updating regularly. I worked with Phil Tetlock at UPenn. He's sort of the expert on super forecasting. These are people who are really good at predicting the future, not because they're psychic, but because they're really good statisticians and really good at reading data and trends. Um, and the best ones, they tend to hold their beliefs flexibly and update regularly. So you don't want to have any belief that's so rigid, it cannot be changed by new evidence because you've already made up your mind. New evidence is irrelevant at this point. But rather being open to that evidence and then updating in small amounts often. And, like rather than thinking about this is definitely right or this is definitely wrong, thinking about things like, well, I'm like 90% sure this might be right. And then that leaves room for you to change your mind as more evidence comes in. So that is all.
Well, thank you, Cory. That's really very remarkable survey of what's happening in academia, and I can vouch for that as well. Let me take just 2 minutes to talk about our let's see if we can do this. So again, the North American Unitarian Association is a member service organization, and you may support us by either a one-time donation or a recurring pledge. We are dedicated to promoting the practice of liberal religion by embracing freedom, reason, and tolerance. And we have some upcoming events. For those of you who can attend, the book club will be the last Thursday in the month. We'll be reading and discussing the book God is Not One by Stephen Prothero. The worship service next week at this time will be titled Peace, Love, Understanding, and Manure. An intriguing title, although I have no idea what it means. We'll have circles are running a bit slow this summer, but the Joys and Sorrows circle will be in 3 weeks. And then the next Academy session will be Tuesday, September 8th at the usual time, and that will be about the Innocence Project and forgiveness. And with that, I'll stop sharing and we'll take some questions.